All right. So let our audience into the webinar. Welcome to powerHouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris Molnar. I'm the events coordinator and manager here. And today I am very excited to be bringing you the launch of Archway Editions' first book, The Haunting of Lin-Manuel Miranda by Ishmael Reed. Me and my co-publisher Nick saw the play on opening night in May 2019, and we were so moved that we immediately decided that we'd try and publish it. Fast forward a year and a half, and now not only does it exist to buy from powerHouse or from any bookstore distributed by Simon & Schuster, but we created an entire literary imprint called Archway Editions to do it. And see the book here. Ishmael will be in conversation with the historian Gerald Horne. You can buy copies of the book at powerhousebookstores.com. The link is in the event page, and I'll post it here as well. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and it'll take questions into the event. And let me introduce our speakers now. Gerald Horne is John Jay and Rebecca Moore's professor of African American history at the University of Houston. He has published more than 36 books, including The Counter-Revolution of 1776, The Dawning of the Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, and Jazz and Justice. Ishmael Reed is the author of over 25 books, including Mumbo Jumbo, Yellowback Radio Broke Down, Conjugating Hindi, and most recently, Malcolm and Me, and Why the Black Hole Sings the Blues. He's also a publisher, television producer, songwriter, radio and television commentator, lecturer, and long has been devoted to exploring an alternative Black aesthetic, the trickster tradition, or neo-Hoodooism. A regular contributor to Counterpunch and founder of the Before Columbus Foundation. He taught at the University of California, Berkeley for over 30 years, retiring in 2005. And I'll hand it over now.
To me, I take it.
All right.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to be in the same virtual space as the inimitable Ishmael Reed, who not only is a publisher and television producer, but also a cartoonist, a musician, a linguist, a singer. And in some ways, the baton has been passed to Ishmael Reed in a long line, a long lineage that at least stretches back to Richard Wright and through James Baldwin, up to Ishmael Reed, who fortunately is still in the land of the living. This book at hand is an excavation, if you like, of the prodigiously, fabulously wealthy Broadway musical, Hamilton, which tends to glorify the founding fathers in blackface and brownface, a musical saluted by Dick Cheney and other conservatives, now making a small fortune for Miranda and a large fortune for Disney. And it's going to be the subject of our discussion this evening. But I'd like to first of all ask Ishmael a question, which is that you say that in the opening page, that among others, the book is dedicated to Toni Morrison, the Nobel laureate who only passed away within the last year or so, and also could be seen as part of that lineage that I just articulated, Richard Wright, James Baldwin, up to yourself. Why did you dedicate this book to Toni Morrison? And perhaps you could recollect on your experiences with her before we dig into the text.
Well, Toni Morrison was one of the major contributors to this project because she turned her apartment, she and her son, Dino or Harold Morrison, turned their apartment, New York apartment, over to us, which saved us thousands in hotel bills. So that's why the dedication is there, because we didn't have any money. Matter of fact, the reading was staged for $5,000. So it's $5,000 against their $1 billion project. And so Toni and I were friends going back to the 70s. I used to have lunch with her at Random House when she was an editor there. And my editor was the great Anne Freegood. And I contributed to some of her projects. For example, the Black Book. She consulted with me about the Black Book. I taught her books at universities. I'm teaching now at the California College of the Arts, and I've used her books in my courses. So we had a long friendship, and she was on a deathbed while the play was being rehearsed. And I had conversations with her about her books. And the last thing I said to her, I said, Tony, Jesus is not through with you. And he said, I'm not through with him. So up there in heaven, probably conducting a seminar right now. But we had a very long relationship, although, you know, honorary feminists, these are usually white men from other ethnic groups who all of a sudden latch on to the Black feminist movement and try to separate us, try to divide, you know, Black male writers like myself from Black women writers. When I was influenced by Black women writers, as a matter of fact, I wrote a book called Records Eyeballing and cited their texts a lot. And Ntozake Shange was in correspondence with me until her deathbed, until she died that last year. And I was the first to publish Colored Girls. Yet one of these honorary feminists went to the Washington Post and tried to smear me, and her family had to intervene. So the Washington Post had to apologize to me. So I say, just like blues and rock and roll have been Elvised, so has the Black feminist movement. The white guys are making all the money. I'm not going to say any more about that. As you know, and I owe a lot. I'll get to this shortly about how much I owe to you for this play. There's a divide and conquer strategy all over the world, whether it's gender against gender, or whether it's religion in clash. I wrote a book called Conjugating Hindi, my most recent novel. Not a peep in this country about it, except for some, you know, alternate newspapers. But the Pakistani and Indian critics liked it. I studied Hindi for a year or so. Don't ask me to say anything in Hindi. But I found by investigating politics in India that the British also divided religion, divided the Muslims, started a conflict between the Muslims and the Hindu. So this is a strategy that works all over, colonial strategy.
Let me also try to put this book, which I heartily recommend, Run, Don't Walk, to pick it up, to put it in a historical context. I see this as part of the third stage of Black intellectual evolution. The first stage comes with the arrival of enslaved Africans in what is now South Carolina in the 1520s, and they revolt and defect to the Native American side. It's eventually embodied by the great Frederick Douglass, the anti-slavery stage. And then we move, and after slavery is abolished, into the anti-Jim Crow stage, as embodied in the work of W.B. Du Bois, Franny Lou Hamer, a list too long to recite here. And the third stage was foreshadowed in a sense by James Baldwin some decades ago, when he raised questions about whether or not we're integrating into a burning house. And that leads us to the third stage, which is questioning the entire project in North America. And I see that in the 1619 Project, spearheaded by Black journalists of the New York Times, which has stirred controversy, which is a gross understatement. And I also see this in this excavation of the haunting of Lin-Manuel Miranda. That is to say, raising searching and troubling questions about the otherwise glorified founding fathers and what they intended when they revolted against British rule. So I guess my question to you right now is, why did you decide to write this play and then put it in book-length form?
Well, first of all, the play is heavily influenced by your ideas. I mean, long before I heard about the 1619 Project, I picked up on your suggestion that the Revolutionary War was fought so that a few wealthy planters could maintain the slave institution. And looking at Hamilton's letters and some of his pronouncements, you could see where he didn't see any difference between horses, you know, livestock, and blacks. As a matter of fact, he associates them interchangeably in his letters. And so he saw black people as property. He was a big private property guy. As a matter of fact, he accused the British of stealing Negroes from their owners. So that was something that hit me on the head, is that you were looking at the American Revolution in a totally different way. But from my point of view, it was revolutionary because I'd gone along with some of these myths. And I think a lot of the Black intelligentsia also goes along with it because that's what you hear throughout your education. You have to really be a maverick to challenge these myths, these creation myths. And I think you were the person who opened reading your books, you're the person who opened my eyes to this possibility that George Washington and Hamilton and the others didn't see Black people as differently from the way Puritans saw them as animals. This is how the Puritans saw the Native Americans as infidels and savages. And so once in a while, you'll hear from the Trump right the term animal. I mean, even the first family, President Obama and Michelle Obama were depicted as animals. So this was something that hadn't occurred to me, and I had to do more research following your lead. Now, I wish you were the spokesperson for that 1619 project, because the person who gets the coverage about 1619, she came out here in California and said that Santa Anna was a villain. Now, I don't know how much she knows about West Coast history. Santa Anna was the abolitionists. It was the guys inside the Alamo who were the slaveholders. So she got that all wrong. So I want to thank you for that. And one of the reasons I wrote the play is because the historians who challenged Hamilton were published in out-of-the-way or offbeat journals. For example, Michelle DeRoss at Albany, Leroy Montanero, I think she's at Rutgers, and Nancy Eisenberg. I mean, they were the four women, and I have to include Annette Gordon Reed, because she was on the payroll of Hamilton, but she went and told them that Hamilton was not an abolitionist, which made them change their sales pitch. So by putting this on the stage, we got more recognition than the articles and papers that the 3 or 4 women had written.
Also, I think it's an introduction to the text. You mentioned another play that in some ways is akin to Hamilton, speaking of Bloody, Bloody Andrew Jackson. Now, some of the folks in the virtual audience might not be familiar with that work, so you may want to reflect upon it. And do these 2 plays signify a trend, or are there other plays in this genre trying to sanitize the early leaders and presidents and officialdom of the United States of America? And if so, why is that taking place?
We are publishing a book. Carla Blank, my partner, and I are publishing a book that's going to be published by Baraka, published in Montreal. I don't think any American publisher would touch it, called Bigotry on Broadway. So the kind of racism and even in, there's a big discussion about the arts, the opera and the museums and other institutions in New York, about their excluding Black art and Black personnel, and curators. But this is a trend in Broadway, and we have Native American scholar writing about Bloody, Bloody Andrew. Bloody, Bloody Andrew.
Okay.
And this shows some of the flaws in the establishment of historical society. As a matter of fact, I wrote an article in Counterpunch saying next time the members of the American Historical Societies meet, they should have an apology. They should render an apology. Like automobile companies have to recall, bad parts or faulty parts. They should issue an apology for the historians who praise, people like Robert E. Lee and all these Confederate generals and others. And so I called for them to apologize, but we have Native American writing about Bloody, Bloody Andrew. Now, this shows some of the flaws among the official historians. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote a book called The Age of Jackson, I believe the title was, where he didn't mention the Trail of Tears. I mean, for him, here again, Native Americans don't count, And then he apologized and said he omitted that because he was 27 when he wrote it. And we get the same kind of apologies from Ron Chernow, from Meacham, John Meacham, who said that the slavery period lasted 99 years on the Morning Joe, and then he corrected himself and said 100 years. He's the one who said that Andrew Jackson was imperfect. He admires Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson killed thousands of, responsible for thousands, the deaths of thousands of Native Americans, and part of the Thomas Jefferson plan of extermination removed them from the Southeast. And not only that, Gerald, I'm like you. I try to educate people, and on the belief that if you showed them the facts, they would change. So I read that the current president admired Andrew Jackson, and so I wrote a piece for the Washington Post, since they apologized to me for letting this honorary Black feminist smear me. I said, well, maybe I have the attention, and I can get this op-ed in. So I wrote about Andrew Jackson's murder of 400 Black people. I'm sure the people, I know you know about this, but I'm sure that the average historian doesn't realize that Andrew Jackson was so afraid of fugitive slaves, or slaves living in freedom alongside Native Americans, that he ordered the extermination of Blacks, men, women, and children in a place called Fort Negro. Now, this was none of his business. This was in Florida and Spanish territory. But these people had united in this sport, and they were turning back the invaders and defending themselves. And so he got one of his generals to go in there and murder those people. 300, they used cannons that could be heard from miles around. And he said that the idea of fugitive slaves living in freedom would give other slaves ideas. Now, they have a picture of this man in the White House. I saw it. I went to the White House. I was a guest there, and I saw it. A picture up there. Like other killers, they got Churchill's bust in one of the rooms there. Can you imagine this? Irish Americans digging Churchill. Irish digging Churchill. I mean, this is fantastic. Who was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Indians because he took the foodstuffs out of there and gave it to the Australian and British. But anyway, that's Andrew Jackson. So I wrote this piece, and this guy I think he's from Princeton, who's part of the opinion leadership in this country, where you can't get a word in edgewise because of these guys. He rejected it. So that's what we're up against. I mean, this is a whole uncovering, and we have a generation of young people who are really hip, who are really smart. They know these things too, and they object to statues to Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson, these other mass murderers.
Well, what about the character Hamilton himself? I assume that when you wrote this piece, that you looked at some interviews with Manuel Miranda, and certainly, as noted, you're quite critical of his source material. That is to say, the 800-page biography by Chernow, which is a theme in the play,
running gag. It's a running gag. It's a running gag.
Exactly. So, do you have any idea of why Hamilton was selected as opposed to, I don't know, Thomas Jefferson or Patrick Henry? Or is it because of his roots in Nevis? And at one point, you mentioned that he may have been passing. Are you able to go into that in any detail?
Well, that's kind of stuff that you take poetic license with.
Oh, I see.
We don't want him.
Oh, I see.
I think we'd probably reject him. Hamilton was involved in the slave trade all of his life. His mother owned 4 slaves. He inherited a slave named Ajax, who was like a body servant. Her ex-husband came and claimed that slave, but then he had a job with this outfit that was in the slave trade when he's a young man, and his job was to refurbish, Black people, groom them for resale. And then when he came to New York, they talk about how he was, New York provided him with opportunities. Well, he had sort of like a perk. He had a way up because both he and Thomas Jefferson were part of the Scottish Enlightenment. Matter of fact, they both had Scottish teachers, so they're like home folks. I mean, Thomas Jefferson and Hamilton might have been related. They're both from the same country, home folks. So he had an advantage. And then he married to this rich slaveholding family who were very cruel. As a matter of fact, I included in the play a forensics team unearthed the bones, or the skeletons of the slaves who so-called belonged to the Schuyler family, and found that they did, backbreaking work, and they suffered from all these illnesses because of, the ill treatment. Now, these women, party girls, Angelica and Elizabeth, they grew up in that household. So they're part of the, they have to bear responsibility for how these slaves are treated. Matter of fact, one of the actors or actresses, if that's still a word that can be used, said that Angelica, Elizabeth, they were sort of like the Kardashians. Well, they had a lot of help. And then Angelica owned a slave. And I have that slave named Tom, who appears in the play. And Elizabeth was also a conspirator in this whole thing, the slaveholding family. And so they get off they're seen as progressives. They're seen as very liberated in the musical. Now, we don't see Miranda as a villain. We see him as susceptible to the same kind of myths and untruths and things like that we heard in school. Everybody's a victim of the curriculum. Matter of fact, I was left out of Black Fire, the anthology that was edited by Larry Neal, because I had something in there praising Napoleon. And it takes you a long time to unlearn this stuff, I mean, it's lifelong, what do you call it, debriefing that you have to undergo. So the whole family was involved in the slave trade, including the women. And Alexander Hamilton, of course, sold slaves. Matter of fact, his grandson, Alan Hamilton, said the idea that he was an abolitionist is wrong because not only did he own slaves, he sold them. So Annette Gordon Reed, knocked all that down when she was hired by the Hamilton conglomerate. They're making hundreds of millions of dollars. But my little play has followed them all over the world. I mean, with the Disney thing, China, England, Germany, they always mention my play in connection with Hamilton and the Disney project. So, the little drum that could, energize a bunny or whatever you want to call it. Without a little money, we didn't have any money. So I think that we had taught bad history, and we have to unlearn it. And I think my partner made a very good observation. She said that he was really interested in show tunes in Miranda, and really didn't pay much attention to the text. So they had a Hamilton museum they built out in Chicago, which was a big old flop. It failed. They lost money. So they changed the sales pitch. They said, well, he was opposed to slavery. Well, we came back with the argument that when the Haitians overthrew the French slaveholders, Jefferson and Hamilton sided with the slaveholders. Mm-hmm. So what they're saying now is that, well, everybody's right, or all the critics are right. That's a new sales promotion that they're pushing.
Mm. Let me diverge, because I'm sure the audience is aware of the fact that you are a voracious reader. And just to diverge from the text for a moment, could you share with us some of your opinions and evaluations with regard to trends in contemporary US fiction, Black American fiction, positive and negative?
Well, I think the problem is that if you look at the mainstream middle persons who guide American tastes, they seem to be wary of a flood of Black talent. And so for 100 years, the New York literary establishment has been imposing like they're into serial tokenism. And so when the token rebels against the sponsors, as Baldwin did, they get somebody else. So James Baldwin, people say, well, James Baldwin's a great writer. But so is Louise Merriweather, who's still alive. Louise Merriweather is the dean of Black writers. She's 95, I believe, and I think she just recovered from the virus. And she wrote Daddy Was a Number Runner, And she takes more chances in her novel about Harlem than Baldwin does. I mean, Baldwin's book is about redemption, and it doesn't include that much about politics. But her novel talks about police brutality, goes into subjects like where young Black girls have to allow shop owners to molest them in order for them to get food, provisions for their family. She goes into the joblessness and depression and, the administration at the time, LaGuardia, Mayor LaGuardia. This book is written as well as Baldwin's book. And then you had John O. Killens, and you had John A. Williams, who went into taboo stuff that made the New York literary establishment uncomfortable because they were kind of saying that you're just as racist as the Nazis. I mean, these were veterans in the war. And they talked about their experiences where they were subjected to racist attacks by, people in the American army. For example, in the Italian campaign, where you had the Buffalo Soldiers saving these Italian villages. As a matter of fact, I went to a ceremony in Fort Mason. I was one of the few Black people there, but all these Italians are crying and everything and thanking this one Buffalo soldier for liberating them. They were commanded by Southern officers because they knew how to handle Blacks. That was the idea. So that made the establishment very uncomfortable because they got this, the greatest generation myth, okay? So Baldwin was a talented writer, a good writer, but he had to shoot down a whole lot of people to get to the top. He had to shoot down Langston Hughes, he had to shoot down Richard Wright, and it was all political, it had nothing to do with literature, you see. So I think the problem is tokenism, and that's why we've tried to establish our own institutions. You have like Hakeem Adabudi at Third World Press. I've been publishing books by other authors since 1974. And so that's the only way we can get a word in edgewise. But the tokens come and go because at one point, they can't take it. They are used enough and they rebel. Like Baldwin, I think his greatest book is probably Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone. You don't hear much about that book because he rebels against the family, which is this coalition of theater people, literary people, who had the same background and same values, and they sponsored him. They carried him like the Protestant View crowd. One of the people in the modernist circles got him a contract for Giovanni's Room. So he was a favorite because he's offering redemption. He said that, in The Fire Next Time, he could redeem everybody, which is still the hustle that's going on now. Redemption, that's a big trend in Black literature. It's like self-improvement, like the self-improvement industry. I don't want to mention the name of that book, but the idea that we could guide them into being more humane and more compassionate. I compare it with the selling of indulgences. You remember the Catholic Church used to go around and say, if you have money, you buy my product, I'll see that you only serve maybe a year in purgatory. I mean, it's a multi-million-dollar industry. So I think that we have to, and I think it's beginning. This is the golden age of American writing. This is the golden age of American writing. But if you read the New York Times Book Review, or if you read the New York Review of Books, or you read The Nation, or you read the New Republic, you would know that. I can see it. We publish some of these people. We have Native Americans have 4 million readers. I published Joy Harjo, a Native American writer, 40 years ago. She's now a poet laureate of the United States. You have people come from all different ethnic directions, Hispanics, but the establishment will not acknowledge this, just like they're upset with the 1619 Project. There's too many of them. It's like a revolt. You know how the Haitians scared them. I got a poem coming out in 400, what's the name of that book? It's 400 years, I believe. It's a big anthology of poetry and prose, beginning with the 1619. So it's a big project that, I forgot the name of the publisher. But anyway, I talk about how the Haitian revolt scared the Schuyler family. How you like that connection? Dutch families were scared of the Haitian revolt. Hanged a couple of Black teenagers because they thought there was part of some conspiracy originating in Haiti. that one of the black kids had heard about some revolt on the ship. They made up a whole bunch of stuff. And the Schuyler family, General Schuyler, General Philip Schuyler, was part of the Dutch, hierarchy in Albany at the time, who agitated for these kids to be hanged. So these things are all connected.
As a playwright, how deeply involved do you get in the production? I mean, for example, do you get involved in the casting? Obviously, you raise the money, at least in part, for the production. How much are you a stickler for the actors reciting the lines as you write them, or do you allow their interpretation to bleed into improvisation?
I'm pretty relaxed. As a matter of fact, I told one cast, I said, maybe one day you'll recite the play the way, act the play the way I wrote it. But I get plenty of help. Rome Neal, and Dan Gallant at the New York Rican Poets Cafe. The only play theaters in the United States that will do my plays are the Black Repertory Theater in Berkeley and the New York Rican Poets Cafe in New York. I've been producing plays there since the 90s, and Rome Neal does magical things. He's a great director. He has his Banana Pudding Jazz series there and has a lot of jazz musicians on there. But we did an opera, and he's able to put everybody on stage. I mean, it's amazing what he can do. So, I mean, he usually does the casting. My partner, who's a master at the theater, sometimes she becomes associate director, or she's what I call a cleaner. Like that movie where Samuel Jackson, his job was to come and clean up a crime scene before the police got there. So that's, she sort of cleans it up before the critics get there, before the critics. So we have a lot of help. We have actors who are willing to sacrifice, to get roles that are denied them by television and Hollywood, who's the kind of roles they're assigned to black actors, no different than the old days. Nothing's changed in 100 years. I mean, you look at some of the series on TV now, you see black women playing maids and prostitutes, and the black guys playing hoodlums, thugs and all this same stuff. So they get challenging roles. So we've been very lucky to have sort of like actors who play in a number of plays. We get called upon them to play to perform again. I did one play called The Final Version, where Ralph Ellison type character spends time trying to denounce his radical past, which is what happened. So my partner, she's directed plays in the Middle East. She directed a play there a few years ago, which included Syrian and Palestinian actors. And she directed my play in China. Now, this is a play that I tried to get in the United States, but I got it done in so-called authoritarian country.
What play is that?
It was called Mother Hubbard. And it was performed at the Black Rep, performed at New York Rican Poets Cafe. It was performed in Hunan, China, and got great reviews there.
Speaking of that, before we went live, I was mentioning that my favorite Ishmael Reed work is Japanese by Spring. And I'm going to don't worry, audience, I'm going to get back to this, but I'm indulging myself. Tell us something about that novel, its genesis, its reception, etc.
Well, it begins when I read in a campus newspaper that a large donation to a university who will remain unnamed was traced to the Yakuza, the mob. So it began with this story in the newspaper. And so I would imagine what would happen if the Japanese took over an American university and would be able to design the curriculum. And the kind of stuff that we have in the curriculum now would be considered ethnic studies. Because we have a big ethnic studies fight out here. Governor Newsom just rejected the idea that ethnic studies be required. And so the question of Japanese by Spring raises is, what about the stuff they got there? Why isn't that considered ethnic? like Anglo studies, you know, from Chaucer to the Beatles or something like that. And I had a lot of fun with this. And so the Japanese take over the university, and they put the English department in the ethnic studies department. And they had, you know, over here where I taught, all the ethnic studies departments are all crammed together, and they have to share all the equipment and everything. So the Anglo studies, they'd have to do the same thing. So I had a lot of fun with it. They didn't particularly like the book here, but they loved it in Japan. You know, I had a great tour there, great reviews. And then, as I told you, Gerald, a Chinese scholar selected the book for a course. She came over here for a year, and now my books are being translated in China. And I've had a couple of wonderful trips over there at the guests of Chinese academics. Now, I'll tell you about the Chinese. You see how they begrudgingly will put out a measly budget for Black studies here? I went to one university in China where 76 scholars have been assigned to studying African-American literature. And I'm always amused when I go abroad and among the delegation are, you know, American academics. They're shocked, like in Germany or France or China or Japan, where they have a Langston Hughes Society in Kyoto, that scholars abroad know more about ethnic literature than they know.
Mm-hmm.
They're always embarrassed, and they get resentful. You know, you hear remarks from American delegation like, "Well, they like you because you're exotic" or something like that. All the racism starts pouring out. So it was because of a backlash on my book called Reckless Eyeballing, where I proposed that the corporate, not the grassroots feminism, you know, there's a grassroots feminism. Matter of fact, feminism, the resurgence of feminism starts off as grassroots, integrated, and diverse. Then it's taken over by these corporate feminists. And in order for them to remain in favor with their employers and people who are responsible for advancements of their careers, they single out Black guys. Now, a whole bunch of people are saying that Black guys get singled out for misogyny. And misogyny, and not to say the brothers can't be stupid when it comes to women, but it's been used as a way of suppressing the voice in American literature that seems to agitate the most and is the most demanding and provocative. So that was the point. And so I was left as literary roadkill. Matter of fact, there was a boycott of the book at University of Louisiana at Baton Rouge. And the boycott collapsed because the feminists hadn't read any of my books. So I mean, you know, the kind of tabloid mentality, you know, seeps into academia in this country. And so it was because of that book that I think I became a global writer. For example, since March, my op-eds have been published in Haaretz in Israel, Liberation in Paris, El País in Spain. As a matter of fact, El País asked me, because I've been published there before, they asked me to comment on the Black Lives Matter. And so it's a big world, I found. My books get published in Canada. Like the novel I sent off yesterday would never be published here. But it has a, you know, reception in Montreal. So I try to tell young writers, it's a big world. You don't have to depend upon or audition for acceptance by people who insist upon living in sort of like a Eurocentric hut, you know, who have a very small, who have to see everything in terms of their literature. Now they have a thing on TV, and I admit that I watch Power. I don't know if you watch that.
Oh, yeah, of course.
It's a gangster show. So they got Tariq, who's murdered his father and murdered another guy. What's offering him redemption? Western literature. So they got him reading Camus and Melville, and he shows promise by, you know, making, you know, brilliant comments about that literature. Reminded me of the painting in the Capitol Rotunda. you know, where Justice Ginsburg was lying in state.
Mhm.
And they on the wall, they had a big old painting of Pocahontas being Christianized.
Is that right?
Yes. Huge, big old painting, cover almost the wall. Then opposite that, they have Columbus up there with the flag, you know.
Really?
Art, yeah.
What an insult.
That's what they want us. They want us to be like what the Puritans call praying Indians. You know? I mean, the praying Indian, according to the Puritans, was somebody, this Indian got up and said, all I want is to be in the Englishman's heaven. So we still sort of have that mentality. So I tell younger people that they have to cultivate global audiences. And I study Yoruba, which I'll never get down because the accents are, I mean, the tones, they sing it. You know, I had a teacher teaching me Yoruba, and all of a sudden he would break out and sing. You know. I went to Nigeria, read something I'd written in Yoruba, and people love that. They give you gifts. So I think that what younger writers, Hispanic, white experimental writers, all of them, they should learn other languages and try to cultivate an international audience.
Now back to the text. I noticed that Harriet Tubman plays a role in this play. And if I'm not mistaken, you had some critical comments to make about the cinematic version of her life. Is there a connection between the two? Or
I published a comment by a filmmaker in Conch who was very critical of the portrayal of Harriet Tubman in the Tubman movie. And he told me that the slave master they invented a black boogeyman, which is very lucrative. They inserted a black boogeyman who was used to assault Harriet Tubman. And I read a bunch of books about Harriet Tubman. Such a figure never appears. So Hollywood put that in there for the mall. You know, this is a big, since The Color Purple, Steven Spielberg. Now, I don't want to get in an argument about that. I'm talking about the movie. I'm talking about his interpretation of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
Like I went to a Jewish magazine called The Tablet and said, given the condition of Jewish women in the United States and abroad, why don't he do a Jewish Color Purple? And in the same magazine, these Jewish women are complaining that Hollywood producers won't give them any roles. What they do is they have somebody like Muriel Hemingway playing a role that was supposed to be for a Jewish character. So I said, if they did do a Jewish version of Color Purple, maybe Nicole Kidman would play Celie, or one of these blonde Rhine maidens in Woody Allen movies. But anyway, but I didn't like the way he interpreted, you know, her book, and she didn't like it either. Now they forgot about that. I got upset. They gave me the Dickens because I didn't like the portrayal. She didn't like it either. They didn't read that, where she said it wasn't based on her book, Alice Walker. So I mean, you know, that's how it goes.
Mm-hmm. What about the source material, Ron Chernow's, as you say, the running gag, 800 pages on Hamilton? Mm-hmm. What do you have to say about that book, and what do you think it says about historians of the United States and historians of the so-called founding fathers?
Well, it's a big racket. It's a big racket. I saw one of these guys at the Adams Hotel in Washington. We had some big festival down there, and I told my daughter, these guys are plagiarists. They all gathered around him, and he looked like a historian. You know, they look like they talk like historians, but it's a big racket. They find that they could sell a lot of books and win prizes by extolling these so-called founding fathers. Just like Meacham said that Andrew Jackson's genocidal maniac, was imperfect. It's an understatement. So I think the problem is that the younger historians like yourself and like Leo Montenegro and like Michelle DeRoss. Now, Michelle DeRoss, I write that I remember watching Incident, your book on boxing is one of the best ever written. That boxing book you wrote, man, I couldn't put that thing down.
Out December 20th.
Oh, that was a great book. But Michelle DeRoss at Albany, she doesn't get much publicity. She took on I said, remind me of George Foreman. One afternoon, he fought 5 guys at one time. You know? And Muhammad Ali was in ringside. I said, go at it, George. He's mocking him, but he's knocking these guys out left and right. Boy, this is Michelle DeRoss, man. I said, boy, she took on these Hamilton apologists one by one, killed them, knocked it out of the park, man. So that's what they're up against now. You have a new generation, Latinx, Native American, historians. We need all points of view. We need all points of view. We see Abraham Lincoln. I heard somebody talking about Abraham Lincoln today, such a great, like a saint. Captain Abraham Lincoln was in on the slaughter of the Illinois Indians, Sioux resistance fighters. He hanged 38 resistance fighters, Native American resistance fighters, the largest mass execution in American history. So, you may see these guys as one way, but other people see them differently. I mean, you may think that Herbert Hoover was great. Herbert Hoover blamed the Hispanics for the Depression and deported them, even though they were American citizens, You may think that the Emancipation was the only incident in American history where, people were so-called freed from slavery. Well, years after that, Chinese women were still sold in San Francisco on the docks. So we have a lot of work to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept thinking it before you came on. I was thinking about that movie that Kevin Bacon was in. I don't know if you remember. I can't remember the name of that movie, but he felt that something was going on, something was buried behind the wall in his house. And people said he was crazy because he kept tearing out that wall and breaking it up and breaking that thing down, and he found a corpse. So that's where we are in American history. These historians, these official historians, their little club, it's like the wall. And we have to break it down and bring out all the corpses and air the whole thing out. And I think that will be liberating for the American people.
Well, let's hope it continues. And speaking of Lincoln, one of the most poignant pieces you'll ever see is when Lerone Bennett, the late, great Black historian and editor at Ebony,
Forced into glory.
When Lincoln forced into glory, which actually just tells the truth. Lincoln, even after the Emancipation Proclamation, was trying to get rid of the Black population, except that he couldn't find any nation that would take us. So I guess you can congratulate him for not putting us on the ship and let us float to nowhere out in the ocean. I talk about this in my book on Brazil, The Deepest South, for example, where he was negotiating with the Brazilians to ship us all there. And in any way, on C-SPAN, at the Schomburg Library in Harlem, no less, he's brought before a panel of mainstream historians. And it reminded me of something maybe concerning Galileo or Copernicus. They're trying to force him to recant, basically. And he won't recant. And you can go on C-SPAN now and call it up. It's quite poignant, what he had to experience, and it exemplifies what you're saying. But also, I'm curious, as we're winding down here, what's a typical day for Ishmael Reed? I mean, obviously, you're getting a lot done. So when younger writers or scholars are asking for tips, what do you tell them, and what's a typical day for you?
Well, let's see. The last 2 days I've gotten over 3 o'clock in the morning because I had deadlines. First was the novel, which I began in 1994, and sent it off. And today I had a deadline on a piece that's coming out in Alta magazine. This is a new California magazine published by Willie Hurst III. And I wrote about the disappearance of the blues in Oakland, California. That now proprietors, because of gentrification, are demanding white performers or integrated bands. And so that's putting the traditional Black blues musicians out of business. So I think it's been driven. I had my mentors. One was a Jewish drugstore owner named Carl Prater. He gave me my first job. He was driven. He came to the United States when he was 10 years old from Ukraine and built a drugstore empire. As a matter of fact, he founded the modern drugstore chain. Okay, and he was driven. He used to, give me a lot of instruction. and advice. And these are guys who work 24 hours a day. The other was A.J. Smitherman, the hero of Tulsa, the Tulsa riot.
Is that right?
You don't hear about him.
No.
A.J. Smitherman, the mob was after him for riling up Negroes because he preached armed self-defense. And he and these World War I veterans used to go and interrupt lynchings, sometimes armed, and he interrupted one lynching unarmed. And he threatened the crowd with a bomb that he said he had in his case. And then, because of discrimination in Dewey, Oklahoma, and his revealing this discrimination against Black people and harassment and assaults, 35 white people were indicted, including the mayor. He was a young lawyer. And so when this kid named Roland was charged with rape, because he inadvertently bumped into a white girl in the elevator. Turns out they were lovers. They might have been lovers. She even said it was inadvertent. But the Tulsa, you know how the media is. The Tulsa papers announced that it was going to be a lynching. And so Smitherman and his men went down to help the sheriff, or at least, the World War, and then somebody fired a shot and it was on. They burned down his house. He had to flee Tulsa. He first settled in Boston, and then he moved to Buffalo. As a matter of fact, I just wrote a piece in Buffalo Evening News that was published last week or so, where I said they ought to take down the statue of Millard Fillmore, who signed the Fugitive Slave Act, and put one of, and who belonged to the Know Nothings. Millard Fillmore, big statue. I said they ought to put a statue of Smitherman up, but he was driven. So I think I inherited that from those two men, plus my family. I mean, I'm considered the bohemian of this family. I mean, we have working class people on one side and professionals on the other side. And these guys, I mean, the greatest thing for them is get overtime days a week. So I'm considered laid back. Matter of fact, I had a retirement party just to show my mother I'd been goofing off teaching for 30 years. So that's the kind of background I come from. So I guess that's makes me what I am.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, speaking of Tulsa, part of the backstory of that is that a number of Native American groupings sided with the Confederacy during the U.S. Civil War. Matter of fact, the official line is that the last Confederate general to surrender was Stan Watty, a Cherokee.
Yeah, they're slaveholders.
Of course, in June 1865. But so what happens is that they're forced to disgorge 40 acres and a mule, which helps to explain the Black wealth that then arises in Tulsa. But then with the 1921 pogrom, there's a clawback by the Euro-Americans who basically forced them to give up all that wealth from the barrel of a gun. Now, back...
But with that, Gerald Smitherman edited a newspaper called the Muskogee Star, where he advocated, or he tried to prevent whites from taking the oil from Native Americans and Blacks. But you're right about that. One of the biggest revolts, slavery revolts, was against the Cherokee.
Yeah.
West, because they were executing Blacks who escaped into Mexico. We talk about Blacks going into Canada as fugitive slaves, but they went to Mexico out here too.
Of course. Now, on page 59 of the text, you highlight the major conceit of Hamilton, which is having the founding fathers in blackface and brownface. And you say, quote, at least one of your characters says, I should say, this Puerto Rican American is raking in the gold, and what a clever idea, having Black people play the roles of white people who whip the living daylights out of Black people and rape African women. So to what extent do you think Hamilton was successful precisely because of that casting decision?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That took attention away from the text. People were so delighted that there was an integrated cast on stage that was considered the progress. This idea of non-traditional casting sort of like drew attention. It was distracting, so that people didn't pay attention to what was being argued there. Mm-hmm.
And was it creative license or actual fact to say that this play has made tens of millions of dollars and that it was a 600% profit on the initial investment, et cetera?
Yeah, well, you know, they have poetic license to do some things, but you try to get something on Broadway where, say, a Cherokee family kidnaps the Jackson family and sends them back to Scotland. I don't think you would get any investments for that. So they pick and choose the kind of subjects that they give to which they give a poetic license.
Mm-hmm. At one point, you have one of your characters quote Anne Petrie. Could you refresh the audience's recollection about Anne Petrie, and why did you choose to use her words in your play?
She wrote a novel about Harriet Tubman. That was part of my research.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other books was written while Harriet Tubman was still alive. So I tried to give some in-depth research about Harriet Tubman, who still doesn't get the credit that she deserves. And I brought in that controversy, Mnuchin keeping her off the currency in the play.
Oh, yes, exactly. That'll at least last until Mr. Trump leaves office. Well, assuming that he does leave office.
He left office when he called black women bitches. That's, you know, black folklore, okay? When he called black women bitches, like these sons of bitches, remember, huh? That's when he began to unravel. I still believe in stuff like that.
Oh, I see.
You know what I'm talking about.
Now, on page 40, you say if Hamilton and Washington were around today, they'd be turned over to The Hague for prosecution for their participation in war crimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, George Washington was called by the Native Americans a destroyer of villages and towns. He had a special name. His whole idea of the Native American problem was to extermination, or he used the term extirpate, to extirpate them. And that's one of the reasons I think for, you know, George Washington said there's no difference between, the only difference between a deer and an Indian is a difference in form. So they saw these people as subhumans, and that, you know, what they were doing is like, you know, trying to get them out of the way for white settlement. That was his attitude toward Native Americans. As a matter of fact, they talk about Phyllis Wheatley writing that poem. I mean, the people over there at that, the neocons at African American, here I go, African American Studies Department at Harvard.
Oh, God.
I want to get into that. You know, the leader made a big thing about Phyllis Wheatley and black arts was putting her down. She wrote a poem for a man who raffled off slave children to pay his debts. I mean, that's where George Washington was at, the way he treated his slaves. Mm-hmm. And you remember, he also was the one who sort of like plotted to get fugitive slaves to return. You know, he boycotted Philadelphia because it became a refuge. It became a refuge for, you know, slaves, fugitive slaves. On a Judge, you know, that great book, On a Judge. He tried to, matter of fact, there might have been something sexual there, but she had reached a stage where he could exploit it. No, these guys had, I wrote, in my poem, I found there's another tradition, another oral history about Jefferson was that he's promiscuous. That Sally Hemings is only one of them, you know. I got that in my poem that's coming out in the anthology.
Well, I noticed in the play, it begins with the Washington character having a black woman on his lap.
Yep.
And that's what you're alluding to.
Oh, those guys had harems. I mean, why do you think you take, if you took 20 black people off the street at random, look, I mean, you know, they could, some of them look like they might have come from different races. Mm-hmm. What do you think happened for the first 200 years of American history? There was no television around. No. As a matter of fact, there wasn't Joel Williamson in Crucible of Race? Crucible of Race? Joel
mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, sure.
Up to 1850, the United States looked like Brazil.
You mentioned in passing Harvard's African American Studies department, then you bit your lip. I'm wondering if you're familiar with the book that just came out under their aegis, which portrays the US Constitution as an anti-slavery document.
What?
Despite the constitutionally mandated electoral college, which of course is still working its destruction in 2020, 2021.
They said the Constitution is an anti-slavery document.
Oh yeah, yeah.
They got a clause in the Constitution about fugitive slaves and how they can be returned. It's got very clever language, but they still got a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution.
Well, I know it's quoted in here.
That must have been done by one of Gates's graduate students.
No. It's done by a chaired Ivy League professor.
Incredible, incredible.
Also, to your credit, you mentioned as a trigger for the revolt against British rule leading to the foundation of the United States, the Royal Proclamation of 1762-63, wherein London expresses displeasure at continuing to wage war against the indigenous moving west, taking their land and then turning it over to real estate speculators like George Washington. And of course, during the pivotal War of 1812, where, by the way, Black people, along with the Redcoats, helped to torch Washington, D.C. in August 1814, sending James Madison and his garrulous spouse, Dolly, fleeing into the streets one step ahead of the posse, and then get on ships and escape to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continued to reside. And of course, Native American heroes like Tecumseh were siding with London at that time. I think part of the problem with the construction of history in this country, at least up to this point, is that the historians proudly consider themselves to be patriots, which I think gets in the way of their telling a more accurate story, since that descriptor of patriot did not necessarily include a good deal of the Native American population, did not include a substantial number of the Black population. And of course, the so-called anti-slavery constitution, including its vaunted Bill of Rights, its Second Amendment, for example, there was no right to bear arms for enslaved Africans because, as the occupant of the White House might say, believe me, if there had been an application of the right to bear arms to Black Americans, slavery would have ended well before 1865. And so part of the problem with the writing of history is that the historians tend to either have blinders on or they have tunnel vision, or or I can give you an example. I mean, I'm doing a research now on Texas and the secession of Mexico in 1836, which leads to this Texas being part of the United States. And of course, it's driven by slavery. And so obviously I go into it with hypotheses and themes. And some of them are being validated. For example, oftentimes the Blacks are serving as the interpreters for the Native Americans when they're dealing with the Euro-Texans, the so-called Anglos, for example. I mean, that's a repetitive theme that comes across. But I kept also running into cases of the Black people, even in 1836, when they're fighting against Mexico to secede, certain free Blacks fighting alongside Stephen F. Austin, Sam Houston, et cetera. Now, the way these US historians usually work is that doesn't fit their theory of the case, and so they don't take notes on it. And so therefore, it doesn't go into the book. But to me, you have to try to explain that, because what we're trying to do with this history, we're trying to explain how we got to this point. And if you leave out certain key parts of the story, then it becomes useless in terms of explaining to today's audience how it's like if you go to a doctor and the doctor wants to take your medical history and you decide to not give him or her the full story. Well, obviously the treatment plan and diagnosis might wind up being faulty. And so likewise, if you're writing these histories where you're leaving out key aspects, it becomes very difficult to come up with some sort of plan as to how we move forward.
Well, you know, I wrote a book that's recently published called Why No Confederate Flags in Mexico? Right. Or Why No Confederate Statues in Mexico is the title. You can get my own title. And I talk about how, you know, the picture in the movies and in the textbooks and the official works by official historians is that Robert E. Lee and all of them were at these beautiful schools, like maybe West Point. And in the next scene, cut to, they're reluctantly and tearfully fighting against the North and their comrades because they want to protect the homeland. Well, they did a lot of killing between those events. They killed a whole lot of Native Americans, especially Robert E. Lee. And they killed a whole lot of Mexicans. They were all down there. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis were all part of this illegal war. You know, they had like a Gulf of Tonkin incident where they arranged for the invasion or tried to find a justification for the arrangement. And they went in there and slaughtered people all up and down Mexico because James Polk wanted to annex. He had something called the Golden Triangle. He wanted to annex Mexico as a slave state, Cuba, as slave states. But they said, you got to do it before the next election, so he failed. But anyway, they're all down there. And I talked about one incident where some kids stood up to Robert E. Lee. Matter of fact, I have the kids, they call Los Ninos. I can't Spanish, but anyway, the kids, they were cadets. And at this fortress, Robert E. Lee made the plan for bombarding this fortress. Matter of fact, some of the generals said he was a lousy, his generals say he was a lousy general. He's more of like an engineer. And so they bombarded this castle where these students were. The Mexican general surrendered, and these kids from the age of 13 and 19 stood up to Robert E. Lee. They refused to surrender. And one of them jumped from the cliff or the highest point of the castle to his death, holding the Mexican flag. You don't hear about that in school. And also, there was something called St. Patrick's Battalion or Brigade.
That's right.
Irish Americans and fugitive slaves who were so horrified by the atrocities committed by the American army that they defected to the other side and were hanged. So it's called Why No Confederate Statues in Mexico. Mm-hmm. So these people don't know how heinous or how despicable these guys were, whom they built, to whom they dedicated monuments that are still.
Now, in the introduction, you mentioned that your grandmother's grandmother, Lucy Hardeman, was a slave in North Carolina. To what extent were stories about slavery passed down to you when you were growing up in Buffalo?
Well, we didn't pay much attention to them because we wanted to be assimilated. So I really didn't investigate my heritage until I really went to New York. I never heard of terms like Black nationalism until I went to New York. You know, we were out in the provinces. We were out in the sticks. But I don't want to call Buffalo sticks. Buffalo was a big anti-slavery center.
Right.
And it changed a lot since then. But I wasn't really exposed to Black history until I went to New York. And I joined Umbra magazine and met people like Roland Snellings. That was his name. Then his name is Askia Torre and Amiri and all these people. And they were really up on Black history, plus some students. This is one of the best arguments I know for supporting Black historical colleges. We're in Buffalo. We learn also a little about Black history because some of the students from the Black historical colleges would come to Buffalo to work in the steel plants during the summer. And they had Black history down. You know, they knew where they came from. So I didn't start doing an oral history or looking into the genealogy of my family until late, because we were taught we were taught that we had no tradition or we had no past or anything worthwhile. That's still the argument. That's why Black literary critics are part of what I call the Negro Leagues. I mean, you never see the byline, and I talked to the now editor of the New York Times book review about this. You never see a byline of a Black critics. I mean, somebody who has spent their whole lives studying Black literature in your newspaper. So I became interested in all this when I went to New York, and then I looked up the genealogy of my family and was able to incorporate that in my work. So we can trace our ancestor to Lucy Hardeman, and who was a slave, who was beaten a lot because her daughter would cry, Mary Coleman, who had a business in Chattanooga, would come to tears when she talked about her mother. And so, that's how I got, went into my background. And I think everybody will do that.
What you mentioned that you have this work, Malcolm and Me.
Yeah.
Is that a memoir?
It's part memoir. It's it's at Audible. I did the recording. And, and I met Malcolm X in 1962 in Buffalo, New York, and interviewed him on the radio and had encounters with him in Buffalo and also in New York when I went to New York. And I remember Malcolm as a scholar during my encounters with him. I mean, he was interested in the origin of words and ideas. He's one of two geniuses that I've met in my life. And in the recording, I try to give a different view of Malcolm. I think he went to a prison where somebody had donated thousands of books. And I think he must have read all of them because we had a discussion about Western classical literature. He also had Black history down, where he just amazed me in his knowledge. I mean, I wrote a poem for him, the kind of poem you write in your youth that was so bad I threw it away. I destroyed it. And he said, this is like Dante, like Virgil. I hadn't read Virgil. So he was a man of letters. And I my recording is sort of like opposed to the image of Malcolm as Detroit Red or this gangster figure they sort of like emphasize and try to show him as an intellectual. And I think that what his assassination did was to popularize Black studies. And I talked to two of the founders of Black studies, and they said they were influenced by Malcolm's death. Bobby Seale, who began Black studies out here at Merritt College.
Mm-hmm.
A month after Malcolm was killed, he went to University of California, Berkeley Library, listed about 30 books that would form a curriculum for Black studies. He took us to the president of Merritt College. And the president dismissed it. But when the white students threatened to close down the school, that was the beginning of Black studies at Merritt College. But it was influenced by Malcolm's death.
So he's one of two geniuses. Who was the other one?
There was a man named Fred Clifton. His spouse was the great poet, Lucille Clifton.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Lucille Clifton was, we all knew each other in Buffalo. We had a sort of like circle of intellectuals, nerds and stuff that used to hang out together in Buffalo, New York. And I took her poem. She was writing on the weekend. Her favorite poet was Emily Dickinson. I took her poem, one of her poems, Langston Hughes, he published it. I mean, Langston Hughes always had an eye for, talent among the youth. Matter of fact, he told Arlen Francis that they're writing down there in the village. I'm sure they don't understand what they're writing themselves. But anyway, he's very tolerant. But Fred Clifton was such a genius that every department wanted him after he got his VA. He could have named the department that he wanted to be in. And he wrote some books himself. And finally, just this year, I'm in touch with their daughter, one of their daughters, Sydney Clifton. Just this year, their home in Maryland has been declared a landmark.
Mm.
But he was very smart.
Mm. And I know you've had a lot to say about Amiri Baraka, who obviously you knew being in and out of New York.
Mm-hmm. About Amiri?
Yeah.
Well, we had our ups and downs, but I published his books. I mean, the guy could write. I published Sidney Poet Heroical, and I published his book of cartoons.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we sort of like made up toward the end of his life. But, Amiri didn't always practice what he preached. Let's put it that way. And I think he had a difficult time settling down. He went through different phases. Like, first he was, one of the tokens for the white avant-garde. And he rejected that. And then he surrounded himself with some guys who used to be my roommates. And they established Black Repertory Theater in Harlem. And he wrote about that. If you read his memoirs about what was down there. And so then he changed Black nationalism for communism. So I said, you can always tell trends in Black politics by what Amiri wears, you know, the seersucker suit, and then he had the Black nationalist dashiki, and then he had the workman shirt and stuff. So he was a great writer.
Mm-hmm. I remember once you said that going to France early on had an important impact upon your trajectory.
Well, that was the beginning of my suspicion of what I was being taught in school, because in 1955, these middle-class people at the Black YMCA in Buffalo, New York, raised money for a delegation to go to the YMCA convention, International Convention in Paris. And they selected me as one of the delegates. So I went over there and met African intellectuals, students who were studying at the Sorbonne, because we were living in that residence outside of Paris. And I was shocked because I had been influenced by the kind of images of Africans in Hollywood movies, which is a co-conspirator and, like, you know, corrupting or keeping keeping Americans backwards, the kind of propaganda they put out, like Gone with the Wind and these pro-Confederate Westerns like Shane and all that stuff. And so I was shocked because I couldn't conceive of Africans other than, you know, being in a jungle or something or wearing grass skirts and all that. So I was also, they were publishing a Précis Africain, is that how you pronounce it? They were publishing that publication while I was over there. And, you know, they had these coffee shops where intellectuals would gather. So I was so disillusioned that when I came back to high school, I quit high school. I figured if they were lying about that, what else are they lying about? So I did it on impulse. I remember I was in class and the teacher said, well, we're going to send Ishmael and some other people down to meet Eleanor Roosevelt. And I said, yeah, I'm not going to be here. And it was just an impulse. I said, I'm going to stay home, read plays. I thought I wasn't. My mother sent me to work. I thought I was. I came down the next day and she had the want ads, you know. So I went to work in the library and learned a lot. That's where I first read James Baldwin. Working in the library. So that was a big culture shock for me to see that the American media and the education was lying about Africa.
Are there any future productions coming up for The Haunting?
Well, I mean, if anybody wants to do one, it'd be great. We did a video of it.
Where can that be found?
Well, you know, we can only use that for promotion because of the contract. But if anybody is interested in it, you know, they should contact me. I could give out my, can I give out my email? Oh, I'll probably get a lot of hate mail.
Tell them to contact the publisher.
Okay, it's ireedpub@yahoo.com. IREEDPUB, short for publisher, at yahoo.com. I'm finishing a new play, which is about the relationship between Basquiat and Andy Warhol.
Oh, is that right? That should be interesting.
I'll have fun with it. The ghost of Richard Pryor makes an appearance.
Oh my goodness. I understand that Warhol's mother lived with him after he moved to New York from Pittsburgh for years on end. And they used to speak their Eastern European lingo to each other.
Well, he went back to the church after he was shot. He got rid of his friends and started doing these paintings of the Last Supper and all this kind of stuff. You know, a particular religion that he practiced had a thing about icons. You know, I mean, icons were considered pictures of heaven. And so he did secular icons, all these brands, you know, Campbell's soup and Schraff's ice cream and all that. But toward the end of his life, he went back to church. And Basquiat, of course, I have a different take on Basquiat, but I mean, he was really exploited.
Oh, is that right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They use that kid, man. You know, there's a big industry. They're selling about 500,000 pieces of brand stuff like sweaters, and I got a mask, basket. I mean, you know,
Is that right?
they're cleaning up on sweaters, and they're cleaning up on this kid even after his death. But they exploited him while he was alive.
Mm. Well, I think we've gone over our time, well over our time. And I'd like to thank you for your indulgence.
I appreciate it.
For this educational.
Well, it's an honor to be on with you, Gerald. You know,
And
you're taking it in a whole different direction. You better watch out.
oh, please, don't put any bad vibes out there now. So this is Run, Don't Walk. So you pick up this work. I mean, you'll be both educated, enlightened, and entertained as well. As a matter of fact, as I was reading it, I was sort of imagining the characters. And I was sort of being my own director as I was directing the characters in the scene and imagining what the set would look like, etc. So I heartily recommend, enthusiastically recommend this text. 2 thumbs up for Ishmael Reed's The Haunting of Lin-Manuel Miranda, a cross between A Christmas Carol and a trial at the Hague's International Criminal Court, which is interesting. So any concluding comments?
Well, I would like everybody to read the book and support Black theater, because that's one of the few places where we can say stuff without it being watered down or toned down.
Mm-hmm.
Support the New York Poets Cafe, support Rome Neal's Banana Jazz series.
Berkeley Black Rep.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Berkeley Black Rep.
Mm-hmm. All right, right on. So thank you very much, my good man.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you so much. It was incredible. This is an education in and of itself. Thank you so much to Gerald, Ishmael. I'm sorry we couldn't get to questions.
Oh, we have questions. I didn't know that.
We got some questions. If you guys want to stay on,
Let's do it. Let's do it. How many are there?
looks like we got 10. You see the button down
10.
there?
My goodness.
All right.
I'll stick around. I'll stick around.
All right. Let's do it.
Hey, let's do it. So why don't you read them?
All right. So the first one, to the great Ishmael Reed, you mentioned that you studied Indian politics. Do you have any thoughts on the new Isabel Wilkerson book cast?
Well, I haven't read it, but I deal with cast in my book, Conjugating Hindi, which is a discussion between a right-wing Indian intellectual and a Black college professor. They begin as enemies, but at the end there's reconciliation. But a pull quote or a pull idea or pull, if I had to summarize it, the issue is that some Indians are bringing the caste idea over here, over to bringing the idea of caste over to the United States, and for them, Black people are the Dalits or the untouchables.
Okay, let's see. Question.
My book will not be reviewed in the New York Times Book Review, actually.
Let's see. Which Chinese university was that with the 76 scholars studying African American literature?
I don't remember the name of it right now, but I could get that information if somebody sticks around. We went to about 5 Chinese universities. We had 2 trips there. Matter of fact, the first was in Beijing, University of Beijing, and then the second was in Hunan. And there's an avid interest both in Japan and China in Black American literature.
Let's see. Why do you think it is that U.S. audiences took up Hamilton with such enthusiasm? And what do you think is it the redemption politics? And what do you think is so appealing about that to Americans versus global audiences?
You're asking me? You're asking Gerald or me?
I think it's to you.
They like the dancing and singing. I mean, black people, man, and Latinx, and there's good looking women up there on the stage too, Jim. I might have to say that. I know that's an old school comment. Come after me, right? But it's a great show. And I think that's what people liked about it.
You know, I would add further is that I think an audience, it reminds me of when I teach courses. Many of the Black students, when they come into a course like Introduction to African American Studies, their inquiry that they want answered is, why have we been treated so horribly? Whereas many of the non-Black students, their question is, what is there redeeming about the United States of America? And I think that Hamilton speaks to that question of redemption. That is to say that immigrants were able to make a living, were able to do something positive, supposedly. Of course, that elides the question of Native American dispossession. And so I think it helps folks to feel more comfortable about living in this land where the very ground is groaning from the cries of Native American dispossessed and dead. And so I think that's the chord that it strikes, it seems to me.
So you got congratulations on your novel that you started in 1994, finishing now. Let's see. And see, someone asking, as a fan of Mumbo Jumbo, which is brilliant in its analysis of appropriation, I wonder what you think of the corporate use of Black Lives Matter branding in the recent waves of protests, from Julian Lucas.
Oh yeah, well that was predictable that they would commercialize it, and capitalism is able to absorb its opposition. I mean, Hollywood did a film called Reds that Ronald Reagan liked. He showed it at the White House. He said he wished it didn't have such an unhappy ending. He thought it was going to, you know, this was a movie that sort of like gave approval to the Russian Revolution. So I think capitalism can absorb. And I mean, they've co-opted Black Lives Matter, of course. You see the ads where they invoke Black Lives Matter to sell their products.
Let's see, Rome Neal says, "Don't take my job away, Gerald." And then let's see.
I'm not a director.
Nobody can replace Rome Neal.
Oh, for sure. And that banana pudding. And then finally, let's see. Jemima Pierre asks, well, would you please say more about the Haitian revolt scaring General Schuyler?
Mm-hmm.
It scared everybody. It scared all the planners. Thomas Jefferson. I mean, that really sent a lightning through the colonies, because they thought that it would give the enslaved in North America ideas. So absolutely. And Schuyler was a terrible person, and his wife and his daughters and the whole family were all in on the slave trade. And Hamilton, they brought him in to acquire slaves for them, or to sell slaves. So yeah, they just thought that somebody would go from plantation to plantation decapitating people. You read Jefferson's letters.
Yeah, just a footnote. I just read this little book by Robin Mitchell, who's a scholar at the California State University system. It's called Venus Noire. And so it deals with representations of Black women in France, mostly in the 19th centuries. And one of the inferences I took away from this book has to deal with contemporary France. That is to say, this sort of mania about supposedly not collecting statistics with regard to who's Black, because we're all French, supposedly, et cetera. And one of the things I took away from this book is that it may have had something to do with the perceived cataclysm of the Haitian Revolution and the massacring or the killing of thousands of French. And that leads to this idea of so-called non-racialism, to move away from the previous racialization to a sort of where it is today, where it's supposedly non-racial, although everybody knows that the black people were discriminated against in France, but you have to maintain this sort of fiction. And the inference I took away is that it really stems from the Haitian Revolution.
I got one more question. They're curious about the name and work of the historian that was credited for being like George Foreman, fighting 5 people at once.
Oh, yeah.
Michelle, her name is Michelle DeRoss. You can Google her. She teaches at State University of New York in Albany. Well, she's formidable, and there should be more recognition of her work. Because she shut down the Hamilton thing before I even got wind of it. And but the women didn't get as much feedback as I got because, you know, they were, except for they were published in out of the way publications. I think Nancy Eisenberg got a book. Incidentally, Gerald, we gave Lerone Bennett the American Book Award before he died.
Oh, good.
He came to New York to pick it up. He traveled from Chicago.
That was for the Lincoln book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good, good.
Matter of fact, there's a picture of the ceremony in Jet Magazine if you want to look it up.
Oh, right on.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I think that's all the questions.
Gerald, they should have given you the Pulitzer Prize, man.
Oh.
That was your idea.
Hey, as long as they don't indict me, I'm fine.
Okay, take care, everybody.
Hey, good luck to you. Thank you, sir.